Hello everyone. Good morning if you're dialing in from the US, and good afternoon for those of you joining us in Europe. My name is Alistair Wheate. I am a consultant here at Onalytica. We're an influencer marketing specialist, and today I'm going to talk with you about the 5 key influencer personas to help you think about what sort of influencers to engage with as part of your influencer relation strategies and campaigns, and then also when you've got different influencer types in your programs, maybe different ways to interact with influencers and different things to expect to get out of the engagement, how it's going to benefit you, and also what's going to be in it for the influencer. If you have questions, there is a panel in the Bright Talk console to send questions, so feel free to put questions in whilst I'm talking now, and I'll make some time at the end to answer questions. You can also tweet us either at Onalytica, or you can get me direct. I'm at Wheate. And my email address is also there if you want to send me a question afterwards. But yeah, happy to take questions either during the live webinar or directly with you later. And I will try and make some time to answer questions at the end of this talk. So first of all, just to be clear what we're talking about when we say influencer. Influencer can really mean a very wide range of different sorts of people who are using social media for a whole variety of different means. Just to be clear for anyone joining this, thinking that we're just going to be talking about influencers online looking to basically sell their personal profile to brands to advertise to their audience, that is one aspect of influence marketing, and probably the bit maybe getting the most money and attention and hype about it. But there's a lot more to influence marketing than just that type of influencer engagement. So when we're talking about influencers and the client programs that we're working on, we're looking at a wide variety of different types of people. So there's a few of them on the screen here. So we are looking at maybe more traditional influencers in terms of journalists and broadcasters, but we're increasingly seeing a wider range of people like academics, industry leaders, lawyers, etc., all building up large followings online, and they're just sharing their thoughts. They're not particularly trying to be influential, they just are, and they have a following because people recognize their expertise or their humor or their the particular campaigns that they're supporting. And of course, influencers can also be business leaders, so might be CEOs or marketing leaders. It can also be people within a business who have got a particular field of expertise. It can also be topical communities, so it might be parenting bloggers or animal rights activists, and it can also be your own staff being advocates for your brand. It could be partners, and obviously in the political space, there's a whole range of influencers as well. And of course, we've got your obvious category of celebrity here. So just wanted to be clear from the start that we're looking at a very wide range of influencers, and they'll all be using social media for different reasons. So what I want to talk about today is how to think about these different types of influencers, the way that they behave online, how they're using social media, and why you need to think about different persona types in terms of then who to invite to your programs, who to engage with as a business, who to listen to, etc. So when looking at influencer personas, these need to be considered alongside their type. And the first thing to look at is, what is the influencer typically posting about? Are they posting about themselves, what they're doing? Are they posting about events that they're attending? Are they posting about the news? Are they posting about what other people are talking about, sharing others' content? The second thing to consider is, what kind of posts do they do? So are they posting images, videos, links? And obviously, if they're posting on Instagram, yes, it probably will just be images. YouTube will be videos. But looking across all of their social activity, you need to look at just the whole of their social media output. And they may be posting text only, or they may be quoting other people's content. Importantly for both of these, I'm not looking at topics. So a lot of what we do on Onalytica is we look at what people are talking about in terms of a particular topic or theme, and we have software that helps analyze and find people talking about a certain topic. That's not the focus of today's talk. We'll cover that in a later webinar. And the final point to consider then is, do they engage in conversation with other people online? So are they mainly just using their social channel as a broadcast outlet, so they're just pumping out pictures or just telling people what they're doing, or are they actually looking to mention other people, to have a conversation online? So those are 3 key things to consider when you're looking at a persona. So then here are what I think are the 5 key influencer personas, and I'm going to go and explain what these are. So we've got creators, curators, conversation starters, connectors, and commentators. And I just want to say right up front that these persona types are not mutually exclusive, so you can be one or more or all of these different persona types. And it also doesn't mean that when someone, I'm going to give a few examples. If I say that this person is a commentator, that doesn't mean that they're also not maybe a content creator or a curator. But I'm just trying to give these persona types just to help you think about different types of influence behavior and the different sort of things that they can bring to your organization if you're going to work with them or analyze what they're doing. So just to go through these in a bit more detail. So content creators. So this is maybe the more obvious one. So these are people sharing their own original content. So they're taking their own pictures, they're making their own videos, they're writing their own blog posts, and they're using social media as a way of showing the world what they've done. So content curators. These are primarily people that are sharing content from others. So it's not their own content. There is actually, I think, a skill for the good content curators in that they are picking out content that's particularly interesting. They're not just doing like a lazy retweet or copy-paste job. Often they will maybe read a longer article and pick out a particularly important chart from it and then add their own little comment on it. Or they may combine different pieces of content together, but they're mainly bringing a selection of the good content that they're seeing online. And really good creators are often the ones looking in unusual places to find new content. Or sometimes they may be even repurposing old content that maybe has got new relevancy based upon a particular event or something that a brand has done. And also that a good curator is very aware of their audience and what they're particularly interested in, and they'll find a range of content to then share. So conversation starters, these are people that are primarily there to provoke conversation and debate. It's a bit like they're using social media as a town hall. They're starting a conversation, they're throwing a thought out, and they want to create a dialogue with people online. Now connectors, these are people that are primarily out to engage with others, particularly other influencers online. And connectors are particularly good at going to conferences and events and then maybe taking pictures of what they're doing with other people, mentioning other people online, and bringing more people into a longer-term conversation. And finally, commentators. These are people that are mainly reacting to current events and stories. So I'd say a lot of journalists I would put actually more in this sort of commentator category. So something's happened, and then people look to the commentators to kind of tell them what's really going on, to give some more detailed insight. But they're primarily kind of reacting to something that's happening and then maybe creating an argument off the back of it. So yeah, they may well create a conversation, but it's more as a reaction to something else that's happened. So those are just the very top level what those 5 different persona types are, the sort of behaviors, the main sort of behaviors that you see with these different personas. So now just to give a few examples of different types of people. So as I said, the content creator, I think is perhaps the more obvious one that people think of when they think of influencers. I'm not actually going to spend much time on this. There's loads of, I heard someone talk the other day about there being millions of these sorts of influencers out there. Particularly Instagram has been the main one, but Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter to a lesser extent also big for people creating content and sharing it. And there's just a few examples of Instagram influencers creating their own content, different types. And yeah, they're mainly there just to be original, be creative, and this is often more where you see the sort of paid brand engagement, people paying for an influencer to create content. I think it's also worth saying that I think in 2018 we're going to see more of an emphasis on influencers value add being about their originality and their content creation rather than their audience, because I think there's going to be a change in the dynamic in how, particularly on Facebook and Instagram, brands are able to then reach the audience of an influencer by the influencer posting something. I think brands are going to increasingly have to pay to get access to audiences if they're doing it through a paid engagement. And so that's why the creativity and originality of content creators is going to be all the more important. But then to look at some individual profiles. So curators. So I think one example of a good curator online is a guy called Vela Afshar. He works for Salesforce. He's one of their evangelists. And so he's primarily looking at a B2B audience interested in a whole range of things to do with software, SaaS cloud computing, but then a whole range of other issues as well. And there's also a number of causes that Salesforce as a brand are very supportive of, and also Vala's interested in personally too. We do quite a bit of work with the World Economic Forum, and Vala's actually a very good conduit for sharing their content, and often he gets more shares on his post with their content than they do. And so I think one of the things that people like Vala do well is they are able to pick out a nice little piece of content, and it's good content, and then maybe just add a little piece of commentary on it. Or if they're looking at a long form content, they might just take a particular insightful comment from a longer article, or take a chart, or maybe sort of take a little digest piece of video and share it out. It needs to not be too spammy, and it needs to be interesting, it needs to be unique. And so if you're working with a content curator as a brand, it's really great if they see you as a valid source of content, because there's a ready-made channel for you to get amplification. Here at Onalytica, I think we've actually got a number of really good curators who share our content. So that means whenever we publish a new blog post, we've actually got a lot of shares very quickly, because there are people who kind of trust us as a content creator, and then share it to their audience because they know their audience is interested in what we're doing. So just to give another example of this time a conversation starter. So I think Tom Goodwin. So he's Tom F Goodwin on Twitter, and he's got a large following on LinkedIn as well. He is particularly good at, I think, just starting a conversation. So often he'll just have a thought, and he'll just post about it on Twitter or LinkedIn. Sometimes he'll do the same piece on both, but often he does different stuff on the two platforms. And there's a whole audience of people there who actually will then respond to that. So he's quite good at just provoking a discussion. And I think one of the good things with him is actually he does respond. He doesn't just throw something out there and run away. He often will then take part in the conversation as well. So I think Tom's a good example of someone who can get a conversation started, and it's then quite interesting to go and read the comments, because there are some other people who are sharing interesting things in the follow-up to that. And then to look at one more type. So, oops, it's gone too quickly there, sorry. So this is an example of a connector. So I think Tamara McCleary, there is another C in the name, so I don't know if Tamara sees this. Sorry, I spelled your name wrong there. But Tamara is, I think, a really good connector. So Tamara goes to lots of events. She's a marketing professional, and she does a lot of work with tech and B2B brands. And so she goes to conferences a lot, and is particularly good at then sort of sharing what's happening at the conference, and knows a lot of people in the industry, and will often then mention other people both on particularly LinkedIn and Twitter, but also her Facebook page. So I think actually her Facebook page is probably the best place for her, where she has these conversations. So that's that post in the middle is actually on her Facebook page. And so connectors can be really good for you as a brand if you want to then just start to build relationships with other people, and particularly for running a conference or an event, they're good at making the discussion around the event a bit more lively and engaging. And then just to give an example of a commentator here, this is Ian Bremmer. So he is the CEO of Eurasia Group. So he works at a global risk advisory firm. I think he's actually now I saw on his Twitter feed he's written the leading article in this week's edition of Time magazine talking about China. So he's an influential writer, but I think one of the things he's particularly good at is he comments on stuff happening in the media. So there's actually a tweet from him there in the top right of the slide talking about the very tragic shooting in Texas this weekend, and comparing it with then the attack in New York when people were run over. And then just making a comment there about where one's treated as a mental health problem, whereas the other is referred to as a degenerate animal. And so that's then got nearly 1,000 retweets, and that's kind of quite typical of Ian's comments. Is often he'll just say something. He's got a large following, but he's particularly good at, I think, just responding to something that's happened and giving his own commentary. And he's he's particularly active talking about things like climate change. So there's the post that he did on Twitter and LinkedIn. So it's the same post. He's just posted to the two platforms, but both have generated quite a lot of engagement. But the interesting thing with someone like Ian as a commentator, and this is I think true of actually quite a few commentators, is that they don't really engage much in conversation with people. So this is actually a view of Ian in one of our client programs where he's one of the influencers that we're tracking. So lots of those red lines on the network map, and you'll see there are all the people connecting with him, people mentioning him. So he gets talked about a lot by a lot of influencers, But then what you see in that column on the right is that the general direction is other people talking to him or about him, and he doesn't really respond much. There's only a few people he responds to. So, not really, if you're going to try and work with Ian Bremmer as an influencer, there's no point really trying to talk to him on social media because he doesn't really pay any attention to anybody talking about him. He pretty much just broadcasts, he says what he says, kicks off a conversation and then just leaves it and doesn't really respond to people much. And when he does mention people, like this tweet I've highlighted, it's normally him actually just saying that he's going to be hosting a chat with them, or he's going to be appearing with them on a broadcast piece, that sort of thing. So different kind of engagement. So these 4 different influence personas, 5 different influence personas, the 4 that I've just looked at in more detail now, they're using social media for different reasons. Often they're not looking at social media as the primary place where maybe they have their influence. It's often just another interesting channel for them. But they use social media in different ways. And all can be really useful and important for you to have as part of your influencer engagement, influencer programs. So just a little table here to help you think about, on the left, some of the different benefits or reasons why you might want to work with an influencer, and then I've got the different influencer personas listed in the columns. So if you're really wanting to get engagement with you as a brand, content creators are the best. So those are the ones who are going to derive engagement. If they're posting about you as a brand, that's the best way to get direct engagement. And the connectors can also be really good if you want to get engagement, particularly around a live event, because they're good at then doing stuff spontaneously and bringing other people into the conversation. If you're mainly looking for amplification on your own content, then that's where curators, I think, come into play more than the others, in that they are there and they're going to share your content with other people, maybe not following your brand or your people online, but they've got then a very relevant and an engaged audience, people who expect they'll be sharing relevant content and interesting content. They kind of trust the curator to pick up stuff that's going to be worthwhile having a read or a look. In terms of relationships, if your main goal with working with influencers is to build relationships, and that's where the conversation starters and the connectors come into play. They can introduce you to other people. They'll talk to you. They'll reference you, and you can start to actually make connections through social media with those sort of influencer personas. If it's credibility that you're mainly after as a brand, in other words, you want to be seen as a thought leader as a business or an industry leader, or you've got individuals in your business that you want to be seen as leading experts, then that's where the commentators and the creators come into play. So the creators are the ones, especially if they're like a writer and they're seen as an expert on a particular topic, if they start talking about you, writing about you, that gives great credibility. So in terms of engagement, that top line, if you're looking for credibility, I think it's difficult to do paid activation in the credibility space, because sometimes the fact that you're paying an influencer can, to a degree, undermine any credibility gain by that influencer talking about you. Similar thing with commentators. So these are people who are seen as being very knowledgeable, good at giving quick insights and response when something happens. So if they start talking about you in a positive way when you've done something as a business, that's also going to add to your credibility. And also, they're not typically the sort of people that can be paid to go and do something for you as a brand. If it's responsiveness that you're after, in other words, you're actually doing something like a live event, or you're doing something that you need a quick piece of engagement on, then that's often where the connectors and the commentators can come in, because it's actually something that's happening now, and then you can start getting a conversation. Obviously, creators can do that as well, but then that's again more something that has to be kind of pre-planned. It's not something that necessarily would happen sort of straight away. So what I'm talking about here is that if you've got a relationship with a connector or a commentator and something happens, like maybe you've just published a piece of content and you want to then get an immediate response from an influencer community, that's where they can come in. Content insights, so what I'm talking about here, this is where you can get an insight in terms of what content you should be creating as a brand. What is going to be, if you can write about a bunch of different topics, which topic should you pick? So by looking at creators, curators, and conversation starters, but maybe particularly curators, because they will be showing lots of different types of content, by looking at their audiences and then looking at what content they're engaging with from the curators, you can start to see a bit of an insight into maybe what content you as a brand should be publishing. And so what we do with our clients is you might say, here are 100 influencers talking about content, and we'd want to have a mixture of different types of personas. What we are going to then look at is, well, what are the topics that they're talking about, and are some of those topics being talked about more often, and also are those topics then getting more engagement from a certain audience. What that means is that we can then tell our clients, look, if you want to publish a blog post, then why don't you post about these topics? Because we can see that in the influencer community, those topics are getting more engagement. So take the cue then in your own content strategy. So that's going to the last 2 points. So if you're really after feedback, in other words, you want to get some kind of reaction from your community in terms of what they think about your content, that's where the conversation starters and connectors can come into play. So and also those are the best channels as well if you want to actually just ask a question. You want to go out to your community and say, hey, what do you think? Should we do A or B? The conversation starters are going to be the ones I think particularly who are going to be the best to say, to kind of pass that question on, or to get advice. If you want to get advice from a community to say, should I, should I go to this event or to that event? So which conference is better, this one or that one? The conversation starters and the connectors are going to be the best ones to get that, because they'll have an audience that will expect some kind of response from the influencer as well, and maybe then take more time to actually give their opinion. So the last one here, this is about reaction and risk. So the influencer programs that we work on with clients, they're not all about influencers that the brand is necessarily going to engage with directly. Sometimes it is purely about actually just listening to the influencers. So these are the top influencers on this topic. Some of them will talk with you, some will talk about you, and some you'll be able to have some kind of relationship with, and others will just be there. They'll be influential, and they may never really want to actually do anything for you as a brand, but you really need to know what they're talking about. So there can be an element of risk then with some of those influencers, particularly the connectors and the commentators, because if you do something as a brand and you've upset some people, the connectors are the ones who can then kind of, if they're really upset with what you've done, have all the connections and then can go out and start telling all their friends about this horrible thing you've done, and then suddenly you've got a problem. And likewise, the commentators, because they are well connected, well followed, are seen as maybe an authority on a particular topic. If they then comment something negatively about you as a brand, like maybe you've had a bit of a screw up at an event, one of your speakers hasn't been very good, that sort of thing, that's where you've got the risk. So that's where you need to really be close to listening to these sorts of influencers and able to respond quickly if they maybe start to say something critical about you as a brand. So this framework as well, by the way, I'm looking here just at the different personas. You can also kind of flip this around, so you can pick out some of the key goals that I've got on the left column, so engagement, amplification, etc. And you can almost put those as columns, and almost then put your individual influencers. So if you've got a program where you're working with a bunch of influencers, I don't know, 10, 20, 50, whatever. Sometimes what we've done is we've then put the influencers down on a list, and then kind of ticked off. You can do this by persona, so you may have an influencer, and you want to try and think about the influencer as more of a curator versus a commentator. But you may also then look at the influencers themselves and think, well, what's the main thing that this influencer is bringing to the table as someone in our program. What I would say as well is that it's important to have a mixture of different types of influencers in your program. So if your influencers are all just content curators, then yes, that might help in terms of just generating some shares, but you're not necessarily going to start really connecting with other influencers. Likewise, if you are running an event and you just get a bunch of connectors, that maybe is not enough if you want to really be seen as having credibility on a topic. You want to have some of the actual content creators and the commentators who have maybe more in-depth knowledge on the topic involved in your speaker lineup, for example, or involved in your panel. But maybe the connectors are there just to help make the interaction between all the influencers more fluid, more dynamic, and also then to have better content to share about the event online. So I hope this framework's helpful. If you've got particular influencers in mind or a group of influencers and you want to talk that through with us, we can maybe help you think about how to categorize them. We can also analyze their behavior and tell you what our observations are about certain influencers you may be considering as part of your program. So I hope that's helpful. I've got time for some questions now. I do already have a few in the panel here. So, okay, so one question is, I work at a startup trying influence marketing for the first time. What type of influencer should I approach first? Okay, so if you are, so I'd say probably not the commentators necessarily, because they can often be harder to get to. I would say particularly if you're looking to attend an event or take part in an event, that could be a good way of just raising your profile. I would go for the connectors first, just to start introducing you to people. I would say generally speaking, the connectors are probably the easiest entry point in terms of just a starting organic, to start from an organic point of view. But I would definitely want to early on start to identify the commentators and the creators, so you can start to see who's really driving the conversation in your area, and start planning on a way to start building, raising your profile amongst those people, because that'll be the ones who will change the dialogue around your business more. I think more so in the long term than the connectors. But you definitely also want to try and get yourself on the radar of some of the curators, because if you can get them on side, if they become aware of your content, then that will just give you a natural amplification boost whenever you start posting stuff. So I hope that answered that question. A couple of more other ones here. Will the type of influencer you work with change depending on whether you are working in B2B or B2C? Yes. And also in B2C, if you are looking mainly just to push products, in terms of just looking to do a kind of a campaign, then yeah, you may want to, if you're looking to do paid activation, then I think the content creators are probably the more readily accessible ones, because you can just get them to create something new. But also the connectors can often be more of the sort of influence for hire, so to speak. I don't want to say that as a kind of a dirty word, but the connectors can also be accessible through sort of a paid relationship to help sort of introduce you to people. But the B2B space, I think particularly the conversation starters can be great. And if you're looking for real credibility, then yeah, content creators and commentators are great, but you need to make sure that you're finding people that are very relevant to the topics that matter to you as a business. They have to have credibility and some kind of degree of authority on the topics that matter to you as a business. If these are your questions and you feel like I haven't answered them, you can just tweet at me or get me later as well. I hope I'm answering these questions though. So another question is, could you use this framework to identify any negative influences? Are there additional criteria that I would need to identify? Yes. So aside from the persona, I would say that's maybe when if you spot, let's say there's a commentator who's got a particular bugbear or a particular thing that they don't like about your brand, then you really need to start to then analyze what they're talking about. So that's when sort of topic analysis can come into play. It's also important then to look at sort of brand affinity. So is it you particularly as a brand that they hate, or is it your sector as a whole, or is it just there are some influencers out there who just hate corporations? They just hate, they're kind of anti-capitalist perhaps, and there's any large business is just automatically assumed to be evil, and therefore you may need to just think, well, yes, they're having a go at us, they are influential, but maybe not necessarily influencing the people that I care about. They're just having a go at a brand. So that's where I think you need to look at the network of those people, so who is engaging with them if they are negative, and that's also then I think where that network mapping is particularly important if you've got negative connectors. And so if you've got someone who's connected with people that you do care about and they're really hostile to you, then those are the ones you really need to focus on trying to win over, find out what their real issues are, and be genuine in trying to address the concerns they have with you as a brand, because they're the ones I think who can do you some real damage, just by turning other influencers against you. Okay, so you mentioned risk in relation to connectors and commentators. What kind of risk should a brand be aware of? Yes, I kind of touched on that a little bit in the last question. So I think this is particularly true if there's a commentator or a connector who has got inside knowledge and maybe finds out something about your business, maybe ahead of your own PR team, for example, or your senior management, and then go and broadcast it to the world. And because they are seen as an authoritative, well-connected source, people very quickly trust what they're saying. This is, more likely to quickly become a problem than maybe just an individual customer or something sort of from outside of an influencer community. But if it's an influencer who's trusted on a topic and suddenly they find out something that your brand's done wrong, or maybe one of your staff members has done something wrong, and then they go and talk about it, that's much more quickly going to become a problem for you as a brand. And that's why it's important to kind of know who the key influencers are in your space and be able to pick up when they start talking about you as a brand. Because because of their connections and their credibility, they're much more likely to do you damage. And a couple more questions here. And so, do you see a difference in the type of personas in B2B versus B2C? Is there a type you'd recommend focusing on for B2B in particular? So, I kind of did touch upon this a little bit before, but I do think in the B2B space, we generally speaking see less of an emphasis on paid engagement. But then there are other things that you as a brand can bring to the fore. I think particularly in the B2B space, the influencer to influencer conversation is important. So it's important to then look at who the influencer is connecting with. So I would focus then more on the sort of the conversation starters and the connectors. I think the curator angle I think is good in both B2C and B2B, and it's good to have some people who just loyally share your content. To be honest, a lot of the so-called advocacy programs that I see, particularly employee advocacy stuff, is really actually just about kind of people curating stuff from their own client, from their own company. And I don't know if that is the most effective. It's useful as an amplification point, but their audiences tend to be other people in the company as well. So B2B side, I'd say focus on relationships, focus on credibility. I think there's time for one more question. I've gone over a little bit. Sorry for that, but there's one question here. Are certain influencer types easier to work with than others? I imagine it's quite difficult to get on the radar for someone like Ian Bremmer. So yes, it is difficult to get on the radar of people like some of the, particularly the authoritative commentators. That's why I think sometimes it's important if you look at a highly influential commentator, someone who's not engaging. What that does mean is that if you do get engagement, or if they are engaging with someone, there's normally some offline relationship with that person. So if you see an influential commentator talking with some other influencer, you may want to then look at how they're talking with them, and maybe try and look at whether there's some, there might be colleagues or ex-colleagues, or they're actually working together in some other capacity, or they're both, I don't know, got the same sort of political interests, or some other kind of hobby in common. And you might then want to try and map your way to the tier one commentator by looking at the connections they've got, and then seeing if there's people that can start to introduce you into the conversation. Paying attention to the conversations started by the conversation starters can be really helpful as part of that, in that it's just a good way for you to share something, to share some interesting thoughts as part of a conversation, if you can see that there are other people taking part in the conversation that matter to you. Cool. So actually there's one more question here. If I'm working with a creator who's influential on one particular channel like Twitter but doesn't have much of a presence on Instagram, should I work with them, or is it better to work with someone who's active on lots of channels? It depends. I mean, if you are mainly looking at as a kind of retail brand and fashion brand, then yeah, Instagram is going to be much more impactful for you than Twitter, most likely. So you're probably going to focus on that. And conversely, if you're doing something more in the political campaigning space and looking to impress or pressure politicians, so we are doing quite a few B2G, so business to government programs, where businesses or campaign groups and non-profits, charities, etc., are trying to generate momentum around a particular campaign. Actually, Twitter is going to be probably the best place to get that kind of wider impact, because that's where Twitter has a bigger impact on the news cycle than any other social network. So you don't have to necessarily look across all channels, although as we saw, for example, with the example I showed with Tamara, Facebook is actually the best channel for her in terms of connections with other people. So that's when you start to build real relationships, often they can go to Facebook as it's a more personable channel. And that's when you know you've really got to know somebody, is when they start to talk with you on Facebook. Okay, cool. So yeah, I hope that's been helpful for you. We'll be sharing the slides from this, I think, through the BrightTalk platform later. And if you want to know more about this or need help doing this sort of analysis with your influencers, then do please get in touch. And have a nice day, everyone. Bye-bye.